Good morning, everyone. I want to say welcome to today's webinar. This is the second of a series of 4 webinars that we are having concerning the census. Last week, we did a webinar on how important it is to participate in the census and how nonprofits can get engaged. And for this week and the next couple weeks, we're going to review work that was done 10 years ago with the Lawndale Alliance and a host of other organizations. And we're very, very, very pleased to have my sister from another mother that I haven't seen in a while. We've got Aviva Pat, I'm sorry. And she is here. And please, Aviva, if you have any questions, any comments, please feel free to post. And you might also want to post and see if it's okay if I can bring you on just to share a few comments if you'd like. We do have a chat room. As you can see, we ask that you would share your name, where you're from, what you hope to get from today's session. This is basically, as I said, a review of work that we've done 10 years ago. It's a case study. We think it's very, very important that community people understand, the work that can be done at the community level and how nonprofits can help with the redistricting process. And it's important to note that we can't really do redistricting until after the census is done. So you've got the 2020 census come April 1st, 2020. And then once those data are cleaned up, so to speak, and allocated for reapportionment purposes, then we will probably get into the bona fide redistricting process where our elected officials come into play. But one thing that we noticed when we were doing this work back in 2010, 2011, is even though we were keeping up with what was going on with the news, we still felt like we were behind the 8 ball. Obviously our elected officials and people at the government level have an advantage because they're the ones collecting the data, sorting through the data, and all that good stuff. But I felt that we were still behind the 8 ball back in 2010. So I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to share lessons that we've learned in the event that there's some community-based organizations, some churches, that in addition to making sure people are engaged in the census, that we as citizens really understand what's at stake with the census and the redistricting process and how the census relates. So this is basically the first of 3 webinars, or we did them as presentations, back in the day, back in 2011. But if you can bear with me, I need to pull up our presentation. So before we go further, I want to tell you a little bit about nonprofit Utopia. Nonprofit Utopia started about a year ago. Last June, we kicked off, and we're the ideal community for emerging nonprofit leaders. We've created a safe environment in which nonprofit leaders can share lessons learned. They can innovate, share some of their concerns. And, I think the fact that we are embarking on another census, that gives us yet another reason to engage, on Nonprofit Utopia as well as other platforms. Our mission is to develop the next generation of ethical nonprofit leaders And we provide ongoing professional development and networking opportunities in which experienced nonprofit professionals can share their expertise with the next generation of leaders. And the overarching goal of our community is to give our members the tools that they need to develop strong organizations that will make a lasting impact. And a little bit about myself. I am a consultant that focuses on community and organizational development, and I'm also the founder of the nonprofit Utopia community. I host nonprofit Utopia podcast as well, and that provides another way that we can share lessons learned. We come on live every Monday from blogtalkradio.com, and we come on at 2 o'clock. We go from 2 o'clock Central Standard Time until 3. And I also teach online courses in operations as well as program design and evaluation for University of Illinois. And I teach social entrepreneurship at Roosevelt University's Heller College of Business. And as far as my education is concerned, I have an undergraduate degree in economics from Spelman College and a master's degree in finance and marketing from Kellogg. And this webinar is relatively short compared to last week's webinar, but we're going to go over a case study of the work that the Lawndale Alliance and other organizations have done as far as advocating for redistricting that would result in maximize opportunities for minority groups to choose candidates of their choice. And this is the first of 3 that we did 10 years ago. The data is outdated, but I think there is a lot to be learned in terms of the strategies that we were using and the approaches that we use. So for the next hour or so, half hour or so, we'll talk about the work that we've done, primarily going through this presentation. And you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and participate in the live chat. And then, we do have links to resources where you can learn more about the census. And in this case, those resources they come in the form of a link to the Lawndale Alliance's website. That's an archived website, and we have a page with the files that we use that we think you would find most beneficial so that you can study and come up to speed, understand some of the things that work well for us, some of the things that didn't work so well, and come up with your own strategies. And after we're done, you will have access to a recording that you can refer to and hopefully spread the word. So what we have here is our presentation. This was our Redistricting Bootcamp. This was the very first presentation that we did. And this was presented on April 21st, 2010. And this is the same presentation, except for I think one page is different. And what we covered then was, we want to share the lay of the land, some of the issues that still persist to this day, and share how you can get involved. And we wanted to we acknowledged then and we acknowledge now, State Representative Arthur Turner Jr. He was very approachable. State Representative LaShawn Ford, the late Commissioner Robert Steele. They were very, very supportive in our planning efforts and helping to make sure that the community was aware of the redistricting process. And there were a couple folks from the Census Bureau who were very, very helpful at the time. And those persons were Tony Pitchford and Nicole Miller. And we also wanted to thank the Tutor Mentor Connection for allowing us to use maps that were used for the 2000 census, and we were using those as illustrative tools for for a baseline for what could happen in 2010. So our partners were the Lawndale Alliance, ICAR, which was the Illinois Campaign for Accountable Redistricting. We had IVI-IPO, or the Independent Voters of Illinois Independent Precinct Organization, and that's where I know Aviva from. We had the Open Door Foundation, the Empowered Citizens of North Lawndale, or ECONL, the United Congress of Community and Religious Organizations, or UCRO, and we also had the North Lawndale Community News working with us. And here's a list of the names of people who worked with us. This was a planning committee, and they included Richard Barnett. He's very well-known activist. Melva Brownlee, who was on the staff of Commissioner Robert Steele. This should be David Evers, I believe, instead of Michael Evers. We had Miss Millie Goldsmith. She's no longer with us. We had Bruce Jackson, Mickey Johnson, Jimmy Lee Lard, myself, Isaac Lewis, who is the publisher of the North Lawndale Community News, Fred Mitchell, who is the head of ECONL. We had Janae Moreno, who worked very closely with Representative Turner's office. We had Aviva Pat, who is on this call now, and she also was representing IVI-IPO. We had Sandra Spellman, who's very active in the community, Dwayne Truss, who is very active in the Austin community, which is next door to North Lawndale in some areas, depending on which border you use. And Jeffrey Turner, who is active in North Lawndale, and Jocelyn Woodards. She was with ICAR. So all of these people work together to pull together research and a series of workshops and then outreach efforts subsequent to the workshops. So at that point, we were looking at the fact that the state of Illinois had changed a lot since the last census in 2000. Our population only grew at that time by 3%, and we lost a congressional seat. And I believe this time, if our population has not grown, it may have shrunk, definitely in Chicago and perhaps in the state of Illinois. And the city of Chicago at that time lost over 200,000 people, 180,000 of which were African American. And, that trend continued for the next 10 years. I don't have the numbers, the most current numbers, but I do know that trend of loss is continuing. And the greatest gains in the city and state population came from the Latino and Asian American communities. And that, I'm not quite sure what the trends are now, given the current climate in Washington, but that was the trend around 2010. And there was a belief in some quarters that the African American population has been undercounted, as had been the belief for years and years past. So at that point, every West Side State Legislative District lost population except one. And we also wanted to make sure that we would protect the Federal Voting Rights Act. And I believe at that point, too, there was a new Voting Rights Act voted in that was at the state level. So we had to contend with that as well. The Asian American community was advocating for the creation of a new district that would keep their community together and influence the outcome of elections and better provide social services. At that point, just so you understand, the Chinatown community did not have solid representation. They were split between, I believe, about 3 or 4 different districts none of which were headed by an Asian American. And through the advocacy here, as you'll learn in later weeks, we were able to get a district whereby, for the first time in history, Asians in the state of Illinois and in the city of Chicago had their own district where they could choose, their own, you know, um, candidate without being broken up into different segments, different districts. And at that point, the city was preparing to go through a remap of its wards, and there was pressure to reduce the number of African American majority wards and increase the number of Latino majority wards. And just like you had this pressure at the city level, you also had this pressure at the county level and at the state level. So Chicago had 4 congressional districts that were protected by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and that's still the case. 1 district is Latino, and 3 districts are headed by an African American. And there was pressure at the time to merge 2 of the African American districts and expand the number of Latino districts to 2. And that pressure, from what I understand, I'm not as close to the process as I was before, but from what I understand, that pressure still exists. And, we'll really get a better understanding of where things come out. We'll have a much better understanding of where things come out after the census. So I just want to make sure that I am still, can you still hear me? I don't see my picture at all. If you hear me, will you type something in? If I type something in the chat box, if you can hear me. Okay, David, thank you. Can you see me? Can you see the screen? Thank you. Okay, you see the PowerPoint, but you don't see me. Okay, I guess it's okay if you guys don't see me. You can hear me, you can see my picture. So I'm gonna go through it. And thank you guys for letting me know. So I thought I would give some, okay, great. Thank you so much, Aviva. And I don't think it's absolutely necessary that you see me. The avatar, I think, is fine. Thank you. All right, so I thought that I would add this slide. This slide was not part of the original presentation, but I thought I would include it. And this is basically a definition of a community of interest. And I got this from the Brennan Center for Justice. So basically, a community of interest is a legal term, and it focuses on redistricting criteria, like following county or municipal lines, drawing districts that are compact. And those are some proxies for finding communities of common interest. There's an assumption that when you draw these legislative districts that people have the same interests, so these could be political interests, legislative concerns, and, other things that make communities cohesive. And according to the Brennan Center for Justice, there are 24 states that address these communities of interest directly, and they have a list. If you go onto their website, I don't have that link here, but it's if you search Brennan Center for Justice and go onto their website, concerning redistricting and community of interest, you should find that definition as well as a number of other resources and a list of these 24 states. And I will say that the state of Illinois is not among the list of states that directly address community of interest, but you can best believe that when we were advocating for fair representation in the redistricting process, that we did focus very heavily as a community, and we listed North Lawndale as our community of interest. Okay, bear with me. I seem to have hit the wrong button. Okay. So what are the issues? And these were the issues that were prevalent back then, and they are probably prevalent now. Um, North Lawndale is a community of interest, and we wanted to keep it together. We're very fortunate in that we were able to keep the community together at all levels, the state, federal, county, and city level when the districts were redrawn. And at that time, the entire North Lawndale community, as defined as Community Area 29, was located in the 9th Legislative District and the 7th Congressional District. And that remains true as a result of our advocacy and other jockeying behind the scenes, and probably more jockeying behind the scenes, quite frankly. And, we're happy with that outcome. And keeping the community intact ensures that the political and social services needs of our community are addressed by a single legislator. As you are aware, communities like Inglewood have several aldermen, and prior to this redistricting process, Chinatown had their representation split as well. So we didn't want to find ourselves in a position where we had to have our representation split. So we got this map from one of our friends, tutor at Tutor Mentor, and this is the old District 9, and these boundaries are no longer in force, but we thought we would share at that time the baseline of what the district looked like so people can understand how large the district was. They could see North Lawndale within the context of the entire district. And this was our baseline, and we wanted to make sure that wherever those boundary lines moved, that we were not split up as a community. Another issue that we were concerned with was the treatment of prisoners in the census. Under current law, incarcerated persons are not counted in the census numbers of the community from which they originate, but within the populations of the towns in which they are incarcerated. And I should say that that's under state law, because under federal law, the state has the option of how they want to count them. They can count them from the place where they are at the time of the census, and if they're incarcerated, they can be counted in that prisons town population, which is the way we do it here in Illinois, or they can be counted from in the original community's census. So every state has their choice. And as a result, the census numbers in Chicago for African Americans are significantly undercounted, while the numbers in some downstate communities are inflated, particularly in those prison towns. And representatives from the districts in which the prisoners are incarcerated, they have a history of voting against legislation that will enhance education, job training, and rehabilitation of prisoners. So in effect, prisoners really have no representation. And there's also a question as to whether or not this violates the one man, one vote principle upheld by the Supreme Court in 1964. So that's a little far beyond the scope of what we're doing here, but we thought it was important to keep that issue before the public. So on the other hand, legislators from prisoners originating from communities like North Lawndale, East and West Garfield Park. And for those of you who are not from Chicago, these are West Side neighborhoods. And they tend to be the ones advocating for improved education and rehab services for prisoners who are not counted in their district's population. So our legislators are very, very concerned about rehabilitation, more so than the legislators from those prison towns. The downstate towns receive entitlement funds for community development block grants and social service block grants that will benefit their communities, but not necessarily the prisoners. And when the prisoners return home, their originating communities are the ones that have to help them transition by providing housing, job training, and other social services. But if they're not counted in those numbers, then we are left to find those resources from somewhere else. So unfortunately, the originating communities don't get their full share of funding because the prisoners are counted in the downstate town census statistics. And we thought that this would be a very interesting slide to share. We wanted to demonstrate that the Chicago communities with the highest number of returning prisoners tend to be in communities that are predominantly African American or Latino. And three of the seven top districts were in the 9th district, the 9th legislative district on the west side. So you can see the communities include Austin, Humboldt Park, North Lawndale, West Inglewood, and East Garfield Park. So the potential reduction in the percentage of African Americans represented in the 5th Senate District was significant. Some elected officials have hinted that the 5th District boundaries would be redrawn in a manner that would make it more diverse. So that would include a higher percentage of Latino and white voters and a lower percentage of African American voters. So I'm just rattling these numbers off the top of my head. You should probably check them. I'm not intentionally providing any misinformation, but from what I can remember, about 10 years ago, during the 2000 census, our district was drawn such that it was probably 70% or more African American. So to talk about diversity, making it more diverse, and given the population changes, there's an increased number of residential units in the downtown area, and you also had an increase in the Latino population and a decrease in the Black population. So when we listen to diversity, that in itself sounds very, very good, but in doing so, because of those natural population shifts and the way they propose to draw the boundaries to also protect political turf, the African American voters in the new district, the newly proposed district, would fall below. At that time, it was 55%. During the middle of the 2000s, but I believe around 2000, it was about 70%. And over the decade, it had dropped significantly. So when we look at the 5th Senate District, the 5th Senate District is composed of two districts, District 9 and District 10. The population fell from, the representative district, it went from 105,248 to 112. So that's actually an increase. I'm sorry. And in District 10, we saw a decrease of 9,000. So when we look at the total impact to District 5, we had a reduction of about 2,000 people. So this was very telling. And this was happening around the city. So imagine you've got people jockeying to maintain their seats, and you also have people who are jockeying to make sure that there's fair representation for the Latino community. There's fair representation for the Asian community. There's fair representation for the African American community. So how do you balance all of those interests? And we'll talk about that in later webinars, but those were the dynamics at play. So because the state of Illinois' population grew at a slower rate than most states in the country, at that time, we're talking about losing a congressional seat. And we're still having that conversation today. We're talking about losing yet another congressional seat. And Chicago's three congressional districts headed by African Americans had each lost population and must expand their boundaries. So the second congressional district, I believe, had to go much further south and further into another county that's typically not majority African American. And they had a really, really interesting outcome after this redistricting process was done. But again, those districts are protected by the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the Voting Rights Act here in the state of Illinois, I'm not quite sure the exact name of it, provided a little bit of leeway where you can have plurality as opposed to just counting supermajority districts. And it should be noted that African Americans, as a percentage of Chicago's population, was reduced by less than 1%, even though in actual numbers, we lost 180,000 people. And we, at that time, made up over a third of the city's population and over 14% of the state's population. And it should also be reiterated that our numbers are significantly undercounted due to the numbers of African Americans incarcerated in downstate prisons. And I would imagine you would have a similar dynamic, and I'm not sure, but I would imagine there could be a similar dynamic for the Latino community. And if I have misspoken in any way, please correct me. So this is the former district. This is what our congressional district looked like before the 2010 redistricting. And again, we want to share that North Lawndale was kept intact in this district. And as a result of the redistricting, the lines were drawn further south, and I believe further west. And it'll be interesting to see what happens this go round. So we talked about on the first webinar, there was a whole lot at stake. And for our purposes today, we're looking at political power and funding. So political power, we want to make sure that people on the ground have the ability to choose elected officials of our choice. And historically, at least prior to this last election, the conventional wisdom was that you needed to have supermajority minority districts in order for this to happen. But this last election has shown that you don't necessarily have to have a supermajority in order for minority groups to be able to elect officials of their choice. It is more challenging, but the data does suggest that that minorities are able to do better coalition building and crossover. And that argument is being used to try to further chip away at the Voting Rights Act. And again, that's beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today, but I just thought I would share that background. Funding is at stake. And if you had a chance to sit in on our webinar from last week, you would have seen that we're looking at $900 billion with a B that is at stake, and it's divvied up according to the census numbers. And at the time last year, not last year, in the census of 2000, the city of Chicago got over 1,600 in CDBG funding for every person included in the census between 2000 and 2010. And I think for the last census, that number went up to over 1,900. And at that point, the state of Illinois had assembled a redistricting commission. They had a redistricting, and I could be calling it something. Oh, they had a redistricting committee. So they had a redistricting committee at the Senate level as well as the House level. And at that point, we were trying to get people prepared so that they could go and testify at the public hearing that the Senate was providing. So people at various neighborhood levels were testifying. They were providing alternative map strategies, and they were sharing reasons why their community should be kept together. And they were also advocating for more transparency in the redistricting process. And I would say that prior to 2010, we did not have such a transparent process. The redistricting process was extremely political, and it remains extremely political, but for the most part, the work was done behind closed doors. And I don't recall, and I could be wrong, but I don't recall this level of transparency. I don't recall public hearings being held all over the state and at local community levels so that people can, in fact, draw their own maps and give their own input. So this basically ends the presentation that we shared. I want to open it up for any questions, any comments that people might have. And again, I thank you all for coming on. And Aviva, is there, I don't know, Aviva, are you at a computer where where we can see your face? Is there something you wanted to share with us on screen, or is there something you might want to share in the chat box? And the same goes for any of you. If you have comments that you want to make, please share them in the chat box. If you have any questions. So Aviva does want to share. Aviva, I'm going to try to bring you on live. Bear with me, okay? This is a new platform for me, and I'm not an expert at it. Okay, I can see I pressed the wrong button there. Again, Okay, Aviva, I did want to. It went through the motions. It went through the motions of. Okay. So thank you, Aviva. I wasn't able to pull you up on screen, and I do apologize, but thank you so much. Aviva says, House Bill 0203 in the Illinois House would require prisoners to be counted at the home address they were. Oh, wow, that's great. Before being incarcerated. That is a wonderful, wonderful change. Thank you so much for sharing that. Do you know what the status of that bill is? And is there anything that we should be doing? Okay, it has a multitude of sponsors, but it's in the Rules Committee, and I think it would be a priority to get it acted on during the veto session. Oh, thank you so much. So we should get in contact with our legislators. We should also look on the Illinois website. Okay, all right. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, so she lost the audio. Can anyone can anyone else hear me or not hear me? Is audio an issue for anyone else? Thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you. Um, can anyone else not hear me? Is Aviva the only one who lost audio? Okay, Leslie can still hear me. And Aviva, I'm so sorry for that, but thank you so much for sharing that. So we should go and check the bill status, and we should contact our legislators so that we can make sure that that bill doesn't go to die. You know. All righty. Are there any other questions or comments? And if there are no other questions or comments, then we will go. So I'll wait a minute or so to see if there are any questions or comments. But if there are no questions or comments, then we will go, and then we'll reconvene next week, same time, same place. Okay, so I'm basically giving Aviva the last word if there's something that she would like to share. She indicated that she lost the video as well as the audio. I did type something. I'm hoping that there may be something else she would like to share. I can give her a few more seconds. Okay, great. She indicated that she thought it was a great webinar, and I just thank her so much. Again, as I indicated before we started, Aviva is like, she's my sister from another mother, and we haven't seen each other in person in a while. All righty, so without further ado, I encourage you to share this presentation with others. I encourage you also to download any resources. Again, here is a link to the Lawndale Alliance's archives on redistricting. And here is a link to last week's webinar on why nonprofits should care about the census. And here is Illinois Department of Human Services, NOFA. That's an announcement, a funding announcement for census outreach. If you are interested in applying for funding as an organization to actually be an intermediary, a regional intermediary where you have responsibility for a certain region in the state of Illinois to do outreach, and then you're willing also to have subcontractors, please check out this funding notice. And for those of us who are really, really engaged and those of us who are not engaged, don't be scared. Make sure you contact your state representative as well as your state senator about HB 0203 to make sure that um, that prisoners are counted in their home communities as opposed to the prisons. All righty. So without further ado, I want to say thank you again. And we are going to go off the air and we will reconvene next Friday at 10 o'clock Central Standard Time. Thank you very much and make sure that you share this broadcast. Thanks. Bye bye.